Hello everyone. This talk is from work in the Swansea University Medical School by Dave Ruckley, Nigel Francis and myself, Tom Wilkinson. I would like to talk about our experiences on the Human Immunology module PM249, which is a core module and has over 250 students enrolled. Specifically today, I'd like to focus on one of the coursework elements, flow cytometry. You can see a flow cytometer here in the top panel. It is a core piece of equipment costing £75,000 to £100,000 and is capable of measuring 100 to thousands of cells per second. Now, pre-COVID, students received a data file from a flow cytometry experiment on whole blood. They were asked to read the instructions and analyse and count different types of cells in a workshop session. They were then assessed by a multiple choice quiz. Now, we have run this sort of session for 8 years as a data analysis workshop, but it was clear that we've also struggled to reproduce the research environment that student feedback suggests that seeing a flow cytometer in action is needed. Indeed, the more we reflected, the more we realised that the multiple choice quiz was also probably too easy. So COVID has pretty much just allowed us to re-evaluate and redesign this module with a more appropriate learning and teaching resource that we would like to talk about now. So of course, on top of teaching during COVID, we also decided to design and implement this resource during Canvas's first year at our university as well. Indeed, Canvas is where we pretty much started, essentially converting a face-to-face workshop to a Canvas resource that would improve student provision. Thus, we started with the design of the different sections of the new resource, each of which included different types of learning with clear instructions. We also included formative and summative assessments that were compatible with Canvas assignments. This enabled us to produce a virtual lab experience including flow cytometry, data analysis and patient diagnosis from flow cytometry plots in different parts. Initially, Nigel and I generated a labour-intensive, incredibly long slideshow in PowerPoint. Then Dave built these slides into Articulate 360 before uploading to Canvas as SCORM files that could ultimately be linked to the assignment's functionality. So let's go into more detail on the storyboarding. So as I said, Nigel and I produced 3 storyboards in PowerPoint. We used PowerPoint because it is the easily accessible to all and has a great notes section to explain extra details or thoughts, such as scoring detail, order, and how different slides might fit together, for instance. You can see basic examples of the 3 storyboards to the right of the slide. Firstly, the white blood cell flowchart, secondly, the virtual flow cytometer, and thirdly, the clinical scenarios. The environment we wanted to develop was interactive, and so in its simplest form, what the student saw was what the student got. This allowed students to sample many of the experiences that they would get using a core piece of research equipment, but without accessing the lab. So I'll hand you over to Dave now for some of the more technical information of these resources. Dave, this is all yours.
Articulate Storyline was chosen as a development tool due to the amount of flexibility it allowed for design as well as the functionality it has. For example, drag and drop and hotspot interactions. It also allowed for JavaScript to be added to calculate a custom score which would write back to Canvas, as well as add countdown timers to replicate real-world experiences. The custom scoring was required to calculate the different assessed sections and add all the scores together as a single score that could be seen on Canvas. Custom scoring was also required to allow for students to have multiple attempts at certain parts with a reduction in the total possible score each time. By default, the resources built in Storyline are responsive, so we will work on any device, meaning students who were studying at home or only had access to a tablet or phone could still access and complete the resources and assessments. This was an important aspect of the goal of not letting COVID make the experience worse. The initial build was time consuming due to the complexity of some of the interactions and scoring. However, to ensure students weren't distracted, having to constantly learn to do different things, interactions were limited to a small number of types. This meant they could focus on learning and the assessments rather than the technical aspects of the resource. For example, a drag and drop quiz at the start and drag and drop in test tubes later on were essentially the same interaction. The initial build was uploaded to a review site where Tom and Nigel worked through the resource and identified bugs and mistakes. These were fixed and then republished for a review, and we continued this back and forth until everyone was happy with it. The final review version was also shared with a small group of students who provided feedback around usability and technical issues, which were not spotted by the academic team. Once built, the resources were exported as SCORM files and uploaded to Canvas. This format meant that scores could be recorded for the formative and summative sections, as well as completion status for the interactive walkthrough section. Another benefit of having the resources available on Canvas was they could be released and closed on specific dates and have limited attempts allowed. I'll just show a brief demo of the resource to you. However, if you'd like to have a go yourself or try out some of the other resources we've developed, please visit this link or scan this QR code.
After Dave worked his magic in the summer, we actually managed to run this in October 2020, during the first 5 weeks of term. In the end, we had 4 parts as depicted in the diagram. Thus, 3 new resources joined our original multiple choice question, which we retained just in case, so we could fall back on these if we needed to. We included both formative and summative assessments, as you can see, and we actually made the virtual flow cytometer a formative assessment so the students learned as they uncovered more about the flow cytometer. We built in multiple attempts, with more marks awarded for successful answers in fewer attempts. This made for a very authentic assessment that challenged students in a different way, not just based on recall, but much more about interpretation of data, and therefore required a deeper level of understanding. So how did we go? I wasn't sure if we should add data, but there's always room for a violin plot, which gives a better representation of the distributions of the marks on this module. Here you see a violin plot of the final marks for the cohort for the summative assessments. So a few things to note. Firstly, the new assessments use the whole marking scheme. Secondly, we confirmed that the MCQ questions were probably too easy, as you can see by the green distribution. Thirdly, it became clear that a high mark in one test did not necessarily correlate across all tests, so diversification is probably pretty good in this instance. This suggested to us that we challenge students in a different way across the whole set of resources. Now, we've just published a commentary on teaching during lockdown, and we also have published our virtual flow cytometer software as well in Frontiers in Education.
So an important part of any teaching intervention is the student perception of that intervention. And in this case, it was generally very well received, with comments about how interesting it was to use, that it was generally clear and functional, and that it provided a very different assessment experience for students. There were, of course, some issues to reflect on. So some students had minor technical difficulties, which we were largely able to resolve for the second time this resource was used. And some felt that more guidance on how to interpret data would have been beneficial, which we added in. So student-led refinements have been a critical aspect in the development of this resource. To finish, we'd just like to leave you with this thought. COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to change the way that we teach in a really positive way. Some of the changes that we were forced to make when campuses closed have been very successful, and these should be retained and enhanced for the benefit of future students, not just because we can, but because we should. Thank you for listening, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have.